Hello, it's Ian Bremmer here. I'm Ian Bremmer here. This is Chicago. So it is easily 70 degrees outside in November in Chicago. I gotta say, that climate change and Chicago go together like apple pie and melted ice cream. That is how pleasant it is to be out here this afternoon. Not what I expected to see some clients and all the rest, but that's not why I want to talk about what's happening in the Middle East. And with the Russians, this attack that we have seen looks like an ISIS bomb, we're saying, against this Russian plane leaving Egypt. The Russians are saying, the Egyptians are saying that the investigation needs to proceed. No idea what the cause is. The Americans, the Brits, and many others are saying that it looks like an ISIS bomb. Of course, ISIS is saying it looks like an ISIS bomb. There's no question that Russia, pasty-faced Russians on the ground in Syria engaged in attacks, and yes, most of them aren't against ISIS, but 20% are. They are going to become our enemy number one, number two, number three for a lot of ISIS going forward. It doesn't mean there's no problem or no inconsistency there. The Turks have mostly been attacking the Kurds, not attacking ISIS, didn't stop ISIS from engaging in a major terrorist attack in Turkey. What we're seeing is, number one, clearly this is by far the most powerful terrorist organization the world has seen, and they are starting to become more strategic in their attacks. That is a significant challenge, not just in the region, but over time, much more broadly. As we know, nobody has a strategy to destroy ISIS. There is a strategy to contain the Islamic State on the ground in Iraq and Syria. That's not going to put an end to these sort of attacks. So, much more vulnerable than we saw in the pre-9/11 days from that perspective. Mitigated only modestly by the fact that the United States and Americans are not first in the crosshairs. Secondly, the Egyptian government is going to take a hit here economically. I'm not worried about President Sisi himself. He's going to say, this is going to do a lot of finger pointing and say this is why we need to redouble our efforts in the war against Islam, the war against the Muslim Brotherhood, as he sees criticism. But the real issue is that tourism is about 15% of the Egyptian economy. This is a big one, right? I mean, it's one thing to have a couple bombs in Sharm el-Sheikh. It's another to bring down a plane. And by the way, kind of very interesting statistic, a third of all the tourists that actually go to Egypt are from Russia. I suspect that number is not going to be anywhere close to that in 2016. So there will be an economic hit. The Russians, a very different story. They do not want to be focusing on ISIS right now. They want to shore up Assad first. So it's a time thing. And that means this investigation needs to take a while. And ultimately, I suspect the Russians will say there's no certainty. It'll be a bit like the Russian investigation after the downing of MH17. Doesn't mean the Russians aren't going to be doing more against ISIS over time, and I do think that there is an opportunity for the Americans and the Europeans together to engage more with Russia on Syria right now. The reason for that, despite the fact that the Russians want to undermine the U.S., the Americans don't have the willingness to put serious boots on the ground. A couple dozen special forces is a reaction to the embarrassment from Putin, but it doesn't actually change American policy the slightest. The U.S. is focused on ISIS. The Russians are focused on Assad, but over time they will focus more on ISIS. If the Americans can focus less on Assad in principle, like the Europeans will, there is more ability to coordinate. So I think the time is getting better for cooperation, which does not normalize relations between the U.S. and Russia, does not end sanctions between the U.S. on Russia, but certainly ends this isolation, the so-called isolation that the Americans have defined as the raison d'etre of their policy on Russia, the need to punish the Russians for their bad deeds. Increasingly, it's going to be much, much more nuanced. Bad news, of course, in terms of radicalization in the region, and most importantly, the refugee crisis that will continue to escalate. More refugees coming into Europe in October than all of 2014. Those numbers are going up. You will see more terrorism, you will see more violence, you'll see more populism and xenophobia in reaction to it. Unfortunately, I still think the biggest takeaway of all of this instability in the Middle East is Europe. And I suppose that's one of the most interesting stories. Ultimately, the transmission mechanisms work both ways. When the Europeans had their financial crisis, in many ways the biggest impact was in the Middle East. It was the Arab Spring. It was the Europeans that were doing most of the aid, most of the tourism, most of the remittances, and most of the trade with the northern Africans, Egypt and Tunisia. When Egypt's economies imploded, that's had a much bigger impact on those northern African economies, and that's what led to the timing of the explosion in the Arab world. Now we see it the other way. The Middle East is becoming vastly more unstable. Terrorism is growing. Many failed states in the region. The refugees are going to the other Middle Eastern countries and eventually ending up in Europe. That transmission mechanism is one we're going to be seeing an awful lot more of going forward, when the Americans can relatively safely ignore, at least for the time being. The Europeans can ignore it only at their peril. So that's me here from beautiful and sunny November Chicago. Who knew? Hope everyone is well and has a great weekend.